The story of Nebuchadnezzar's involvement with Jerusalem begins in a period when the ancient Near East was undergoing major political change. By the late 7th century BC, the Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the region for generations, was in rapid decline. Into this vacuum rose the Neo-Babylonian Empire, led first by Nabopolassar and then by his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. Babylon's power expanded quickly, and its influence soon reached the lands of the Levant, including the small kingdom of Judah, whose capital city was Jerusalem. Judah was not a great power, but its location between larger empires made it strategically important and politically vulnerable. Judah had long existed under the shadow of greater kingdoms. Its rulers were often forced to shift alliances in order to survive. For a time, Judah leaned toward Egypt, which sought to maintain influence in the Levant as Assyria collapsed. However, Babylon's decisive victory over Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE changed the balance of power entirely. After this battle, Babylon became the dominant force in the region, and many smaller kingdoms, including Judah, were compelled to submit to Babylonian authority. Nebuchadnezzar II emerged from these events as a capable military commander and a determined ruler. After securing Babylon's dominance, he focused on ensuring loyalty from all territories under his influence. Judah became a vassal state, required to pay tribute and remain politically obedient. King Jehoiakim of Judah initially accepted this arrangement, but his loyalty was uncertain. He ruled a kingdom where political factions disagreed over whether to submit to Babylon or seek renewed support from Egypt. Jehoiakim's reign was marked by instability and heavy taxation, much of it necessary to meet Babylonian demands. This placed a great burden on the population of Jerusalem and the surrounding countryside. As resentment grew, so did resistance to Babylonian control. Around 601 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar's campaign against Egypt did not produce a decisive victory, Jehoiakim interpreted this as a sign of Babylonian weakness. He chose to withhold tribute and shift his allegiance once again toward Egypt. This decision proved disastrous. Nebuchadnezzar did not tolerate rebellion, especially in a region so close to key trade routes and military corridors. Babylonian forces began to move westward, reasserting control over disloyal territories. Before the full consequences could unfold, Jehoiakim died in 598 BCE. His death left the kingdom in a fragile state at the very moment Babylonian pressure was increasing. Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiakim, also known as Jeconiah, became king at only 18 years of age. He inherited a kingdom already under threat and had little time or experience to respond effectively. Nebuchadnezzar's army advanced toward Jerusalem soon after Jehoiakim's accession. The Babylonian campaign was methodical and disciplined, aimed not merely at punishment, but at securing long-term control. The first siege of Jerusalem began in 597 BCE. Babylonian forces surrounded the city, cutting off supply routes and isolating its population. Jerusalem was well fortified, with strong walls built and reinforced over generations. But no city could withstand a prolonged siege without outside support. As days turned into weeks, the pressure inside the city grew intense. Food supplies dwindled, and anxiety spread among the inhabitants. Within Jerusalem, political divisions deepened. Some leaders argued for resistance, believing that surrender would bring humiliation and loss of independence. Others recognized the reality of Babylonian power and urged submission to avoid destruction. Jehoiakim, young and inexperienced, was caught between these competing voices while facing an overwhelming military force outside the walls. Nebuchadnezzar did not rush the siege. He understood that time was on his side. Babylonian siege warfare relied on patience, psychological pressure, and complete control of surrounding territory. As the siege continued, the people of Jerusalem suffered from shortages and uncertainty. The city's defenders realized that no Egyptian army was coming to relieve them, and hopes of external rescue faded. After only 3 months on the throne, Jehoiakim made the decision to surrender. In early 597 BCE, he opened the gates of Jerusalem and presented himself to Nebuchadnezzar. This act spared the city from immediate destruction, but it came at a heavy cost. Jehoiakim, along with members of the royal family, court officials, skilled craftsmen, and warriors, was taken into exile in Babylon. This marked the first major deportation of Judah's elite population. Nebuchadnezzar's policy was deliberate. By removing leaders, soldiers, and skilled workers, he weakened Judah's ability to rebel again. The exile was not a random act of cruelty, but a calculated political strategy commonly used by ancient empires to maintain control. Babylonian records and later biblical accounts both confirm that thousands were deported during this event. After securing Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar appointed Mattaniah, Jehoiakim's uncle, as the new king. Nebuchadnezzar changed his name to Zedekiah, symbolizing his authority over Judah. Zedekiah swore an oath of loyalty to Babylon, binding himself to obedience. At this stage, Jerusalem still stood, its temple intact, and its remaining population hoped that submission would ensure peace. However, the kingdom that Zedekiah inherited was weakened and unstable. The loss of skilled labor and leadership had lasting economic effects. Many families had been separated, and the absence of experienced administrators made governance difficult. At the same time, political pressure continued from neighboring states and from Egypt, which encouraged rebellion against Babylonian rule. Zedekiah ruled for 11 years, and during much of this time, he struggled to balance Babylonian demands with internal dissent. Prophetic voices within Judah warned against rebellion, emphasizing the consequences of defying Babylon, while other advisors argued that independence could still be regained with Egyptian support. These conflicting influences created constant tension within the royal court. As years passed, resentment toward Babylon grew, tribute payments remained heavy, and the presence of Babylonian authority was a daily reminder of Judah's diminished status. Zedekiah himself became increasingly uneasy under the weight of his oath and the expectations of his people. Although he had sworn loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar, he began to explore the possibility of resistance. By around 589 BCE, Zedekiah made a critical decision. Encouraged by diplomatic contact with Egypt and persuaded by advisors who believed Babylon could be challenged, he stopped paying tribute and openly defied Babylonian authority. This act was not simply political, it was a direct violation of a sworn agreement, something Nebuchadnezzar viewed as unacceptable. When news of the rebellion reached Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar acted swiftly. He mobilized his army and marched once again toward Judah. This time, the goal was not limited punishment or political control. The rebellion convinced Nebuchadnezzar that Jerusalem could no longer be trusted as a semi-autonomous vassal. A decisive response was necessary. In 589 BCE, Babylonian forces surrounded Jerusalem for the second time. Unlike the earlier siege, this one would be longer, harsher, and far more devastating. The city was completely cut off. Fields outside the walls were seized, supply routes blocked, and no movement in or out was permitted. Jerusalem entered one of the darkest periods in its history. Inside the city, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food shortages became severe as stored supplies were exhausted. Hunger spread among all classes of society, affecting the poor and the wealthy alike. Disease followed malnutrition, and morale collapsed. The defenders remained on the walls, but their strength weakened with each passing month. Despite the worsening situation, Zedekiah hesitated to surrender. He feared the consequences of facing Nebuchadnezzar after breaking his oath, and he feared the reaction of his own people if he appeared to give up. Conflicting advice continued to surround him, and decisive leadership was lacking. For nearly 2 years, the siege dragged on. Babylonian forces maintained constant pressure, building siege works and watching for any sign of weakness. An Egyptian force briefly attempted to intervene, causing the Babylonians to temporarily lift the siege, but this effort failed. Babylonian troops quickly returned, and any remaining hope of rescue vanished. By 586 BCE, Jerusalem was on the brink of collapse. Starvation reached extreme levels, and the city's defenses could no longer be fully manned. Finally, Babylonian forces breached the walls. The city that had stood for centuries was overwhelmed. Zedekiah attempted to flee under cover of night, but he was captured near Jericho. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar, who pronounced judgment. Zedekiah was taken to Babylon, and Judah's monarchy effectively came to an end. After capturing the city, Babylonian forces systematically dismantled Jerusalem. The temple, central to the religious life of the people, was destroyed. The royal palace and major buildings were torn down, and the city walls were broken. What had once been a thriving capital was reduced to ruins. A second, larger deportation followed. Many of the remaining inhabitants were taken into exile, while only the poorest were left behind to tend the land. Jerusalem ceased to function as a political or religious center, and Judah was absorbed fully into the Babylonian provincial system. This moment marked the end of an era. The fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE was not merely a military defeat, it was a transformation that reshaped the identity, faith, and history of its people. The experience of siege, loss, and exile would echo through generations and become one of the most significant chapters in ancient history. After the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the land of Judah was left in a state of profound disarray, its political and social structures essentially dismantled by the decisive actions of the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II. The monarchy, which had ruled Judah for centuries, was no more, and the royal line was effectively terminated with the capture and deportation of King Zedekiah. The temple, the central institution of religious life and cultural identity, lay in ruins, while the walls of Jerusalem, once symbols of security and resilience, were torn down. The city, long a hub of trade, governance, and religious practice, had been reduced to a devastated landscape, leaving the inhabitants to confront the challenges of survival without the familiar framework of leadership or social cohesion. In the aftermath of the conquest, Nebuchadnezzar implemented a measured approach to governance that reflected the pragmatic policies of the Babylonian Empire. Rather than depopulating the land entirely, he allowed a portion of the population to remain, primarily consisting of laborers, farmers, and the lower social classes who were less likely to organize rebellion. By leaving this segment in place, Babylon ensured that agricultural production could continue, preventing economic collapse and maintaining control over the province without overextending military resources. This approach was consistent with Babylonian strategies elsewhere, where maintaining order and productivity often took precedence over complete destruction. To oversee this remaining population, Nebuchadnezzar appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, as governor. Gedaliah was chosen because of his family's history of cooperation with previous rulers and his perceived ability to manage both the local population and the expectations of Babylonian authority. He established his administrative center at Mizpah, located north of Jerusalem, rather than in the destroyed capital itself. Mizpah, though smaller and less fortified, offered a more manageable environment for governance in a region that had been destabilized by war and exile. Gedaliah's appointment signaled a shift from traditional kingship to provincial administration under imperial oversight, reflecting the broader transformation of Judah into a Babylonian province. Gedaliah's leadership emphasized pragmatic stability over political or religious autonomy. He encouraged the population to settle, cultivate the fields, and resume agricultural production, presenting cooperation with Babylon as a means of survival rather than submission. For a brief period, his guidance appeared to restore a fragile sense of order. Survivors who had fled during the siege began to return, fields were replanted, and everyday life cautiously resumed under the constraints imposed by the loss of the monarchy and the temple. While this stability was limited, it represented an important attempt to maintain continuity in a society facing existential uncertainty. Despite Gedaliah's efforts, tensions persisted beneath the surface of apparent calm. Many Judeans resented Babylonian control, viewing the appointment of a governor as a symbol of foreign domination rather than a practical necessity. Members of the former elite, particularly those connected to the royal family, saw Gedaliah as a collaborator who had betrayed Judah's independence. Among these was Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, a member of the royal lineage, who, with covert support from the Ammonite king Balas, began plotting against Gedaliah. These political undercurrents reflected a broader struggle over the meaning of leadership, loyalty, and identity in a land under occupation. The situation deteriorated when Gedaliah was assassinated within months of his appointment. Ishmael and his supporters murdered him at Mizpah, along with several Babylonian officials, effectively dismantling the fragile administrative order that had been established. The assassination created widespread fear among the population, who feared Babylonian reprisals for this act of defiance. In response, many chose to flee southward to Egypt, despite warnings that this would place them outside Babylonian protection and expose them to further hardship. The departure of these refugees further depopulated Judah, leaving only the poorest and least influential individuals to maintain the land. While Judah was struggling with depopulation and instability, the exiled population in Babylon began to adapt to life under imperial oversight. Contrary to the assumption that exile meant imprisonment, Babylonian policy allowed deported peoples to integrate into the empire's economic and social systems. Judeans were settled in organized communities, often near irrigation canals such as the Shabar River, where they contributed to agriculture, craftsmanship, and trade. These communities, while far from their homeland, retained their identity and familial networks, preserving cultural cohesion despite displacement. Archaeological evidence, particularly the cuneiform tablets from the settlement of Al-Yahudu, demonstrates that Judeans actively participated in Babylonian economic life. These tablets record property leases, loans, and transactions involving Judean families, showing that they were able to maintain their livelihoods while under foreign administration. Such evidence highlights the dual reality of exile. While Judeans lost political autonomy and access to their homeland, they continued to function as productive members of the empire, preserving their language, traditions, and community structures. The exiled leadership, including the former King Jehoiakim, played a symbolic role in maintaining cohesion. Jehoiakim was initially held under close supervision, but was later released and given regular rations, indicating that Babylonian authorities recognized his value as a political figurehead who could reinforce loyalty among the Judean population. This treatment reflected the pragmatic approach of the Babylonians. While suppressing rebellion, they also maintained structures that could facilitate governance and cultural continuity. Religious life among the exiles underwent significant transformation. With the destruction of the temple and the cessation of sacrificial rituals, Judeans adapted their practices to the circumstances of exile. Prayer, study, and the preservation of sacred texts became central to community life. Scribes gained prominence as the custodians of law, history, and tradition, editing and compiling texts that would later form the foundation of the Hebrew Bible. The experience of exile demonstrated that religious and cultural identity could endure even without a centralized temple or a sovereign state, reinforcing the resilience of the community. Memory and narrative played a crucial role in sustaining identity during this period. Stories of Jerusalem, the temple, and the monarchy were preserved through oral tradition and written records. Lamentations over the city's fall expressed grief, mourning, and reflection, while simultaneously reinforcing a collective sense of belonging and historical continuity. The experience of displacement, destruction, and survival became central to the Judean understanding of their identity, shaping values, ethics, and communal priorities for generations. Nebuchadnezzar himself continued to rule Babylon with a focus on both military and infrastructural consolidation. His reign was marked by extensive building projects, including the restoration of city walls, temples, canals, and ceremonial avenues, which reinforced Babylon's position as the dominant power in the Near East. From his perspective, the measures taken against Jerusalem were necessary for maintaining stability and demonstrating the reach of imperial authority. The exile of the Judeans was a strategic decision aimed at preventing further rebellion, ensuring economic productivity, and integrating the conquered population into the empire. Following Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BCE, Babylon faced internal instability, with a series of short-reign kings weakening central authority. This decline created openings for new powers in the region, most notably the Persians under Cyrus II. By 539 BCE, Cyrus captured Babylon largely without resistance, marking a major shift in regional political dynamics. Unlike previous rulers, Cyrus pursued a policy of restoration and tolerance, encouraging displaced populations to return to their homelands and rebuild religious centers. This policy is documented both in the Cyrus Cylinder and biblical texts, and it represented a departure from the punitive strategies employed by earlier empires. For the Judeans, Cyrus's decree offered the opportunity to return, though the process was gradual and not universally embraced. Many remained in Babylon, having established communities, livelihoods, and social structures that allowed them to survive in exile. Those who returned faced the challenge of rebuilding not only physical structures like the temple and Jerusalem itself, but also social cohesion, religious practice, and civic life. The post-exilic community emerged as a transformed society, defined less by monarchy or political autonomy and more by collective memory, religious law, and cultural continuity. The long-term consequences of the exile were profound. Political structures shifted, economic and social systems adapted to foreign rule, and religious practices evolved to accommodate the loss of central institutions. These transformations highlight the resilience of the Judean community and their ability to maintain identity under extreme adversity. The events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem, the deportations, and life in Babylon became central narratives that shaped subsequent generations, emphasizing survival, faith, and adaptation. The final years of Jerusalem before its ultimate fall were marked by not only external military pressure, but also profound internal instability. As Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian forces surrounded the city, the people of Jerusalem faced an unprecedented crisis. Supplies were dwindling rapidly, and the once prosperous city that had been a hub of trade, culture, and religious life was now gripped by hunger, fear, and uncertainty. Citizens were forced to ration food strictly, and those with access to stored grain or wine became targets of suspicion and resentment. The streets, which had once been filled with the bustle of commerce and religious pilgrimage, now became tense corridors of confrontation and mistrust, where neighbors argued over scarce resources and even minor disputes could escalate into physical altercations. Political divisions that had simmered under the surface of Jerusalem's society for decades now erupted openly in the streets. Supporters of continued resistance against the Babylonians accused those advocating surrender of treachery, while those favoring negotiation were branded as cowards by the more militant factions. Arguments between these groups often spilled into the city's marketplaces, residential quarters, and public squares, creating a chaotic and volatile urban environment. City guards and soldiers stationed along the walls struggled to enforce order as desperation drove ordinary citizens to acts of theft, hoarding, and open confrontation. Though these clashes were not formal battles, they involved pushing, striking, and even brief armed resistance using whatever weapons were available, including farming tools, clubs, and short swords. The military leadership within Jerusalem was not immune to internal tension. Soldiers responsible for defending the walls faced exhaustion, hunger, and declining morale. Many were torn between duty and the need to protect their families, and desertions became increasingly common. When commanders attempted to discipline deserters, street confrontations frequently erupted, further destabilizing the city. In several neighborhoods, groups of armed men loyal to different factions clashed openly, and attempts to restore order were often met with resistance. These incidents, although fragmented, compounded the sense that the city's social fabric was unraveling from within even before the Babylonians breached the walls. Religious authorities played a complex role in these internal tensions. Prophets and teachers offered competing interpretations of the crisis, and their followers sometimes clashed in public forums. Some voices insisted that the city's survival depended on steadfastness and divine favor, arguing that resistance would protect Jerusalem and the temple. Others warned that the Babylonians were an unstoppable force, and that surrender or negotiation was the only practical course. These conflicting messages intensified existing social tensions, with supporters of each viewpoint confronting one another near the city gates, synagogues, and marketplaces. Even minor disagreements could escalate into heated arguments and occasional physical scuffles, reflecting the deep anxiety and uncertainty gripping the population. The siege also exposed the fragility of Jerusalem's infrastructure and the consequences of long-term food shortages. Grain, wine, and other essential supplies were stored in central locations, which became contested sites as hunger worsened. Crowds gathered at these stores, often leading to violent disputes when rations were insufficient. Guards attempted to enforce rationing, but limited manpower and the constant threat of desertion undermined their authority. In narrow streets and alleys, neighbors confronted one another over access to supplies, leading to a pattern of repeated skirmishes that heightened the city's atmosphere of fear and tension. Certain areas of the city, particularly near the main gates and entrances, were hotspots for confrontation. Refugees from the surrounding countryside who had fled the Babylonian advance sought shelter in Jerusalem, swelling the population beyond what the already strained city could accommodate. With housing, water, and food in short supply, disputes were frequent. These disputes were often settled through force, with temporary skirmishes breaking out between groups of families or factions seeking access to resources. Guards and local militia sometimes intervened, but the sheer scale of the crisis meant that only sporadic enforcement was possible. The result was a city where fear, suspicion, and short-term violence became part of everyday life. Within the royal quarter and among the remaining elite, divisions were particularly pronounced. Advisors and military leaders disagreed openly about the best course of action, with some advocating continued resistance and others secretly encouraging surrender. These disagreements trickled down to the population, as each faction mobilized supporters, leading to sporadic street clashes and public disputes. Citizens who aligned with one faction often confronted those aligned with another, creating localized but recurring episodes of violence. While not large-scale battles, these confrontations had the effect of fragmenting social cohesion and weakening collective resilience against the external threat posed by the Babylonians. The siege also placed immense psychological stress on the population. The constant threat of Babylonian assault, combined with hunger and deprivation, exacerbated anxiety and fear. Families faced impossible choices, including whether to ration food for children, elderly, or soldiers defending the city. The tension manifested in personal disputes that could quickly escalate to physical altercations. Even neighbors who had lived peacefully for years sometimes engaged in fights over perceived inequalities in access to resources, reflecting the extreme social strain imposed by a prolonged siege. As the Babylonians tightened their grip outside the walls, the city's defensive measures became increasingly desperate. Soldiers and citizens fortified weak points, constructed temporary barriers, and maintained vigilance at night. However, internal conflicts reduced the effectiveness of these efforts. Patrols assigned to guard the walls often had to intervene in domestic disputes or skirmishes between factions, diverting attention from the external threat. The resulting fatigue and divided focus left the city vulnerable at precisely the moment when Babylonian forces were applying maximum pressure. The pressure inside Jerusalem was mirrored by the military operations outside. Babylonian forces systematically cut off supply lines and isolated the city, using encampments, siege towers, and patrols to prevent escape or resupply. While historical records do not describe continuous large-scale assaults, archaeological evidence and contemporary chronicles suggest a pattern of intermittent attacks, intimidation, and psychological pressure designed to wear down defenders. This external pressure magnified the internal stresses, as citizens recognized that their options for survival were shrinking rapidly. Within households, tensions often erupted into conflict. Families competed over limited rations, and disputes over priority for food or water sometimes spilled into the streets. Adolescents and young men were particularly likely to become involved in confrontations, either in defense of their households or in support of political factions. The cumulative effect of these internal skirmishes and neighborhood disputes was a city that, while still functioning on a basic level, was increasingly fragmented and incapable of organized resistance. As famine worsened, social norms eroded further. Theft, hoarding, and minor acts of violence became commonplace. Individuals who might once have relied on communal mechanisms for dispute resolution increasingly resorted to personal enforcement. Guard units faced difficulty controlling these incidents, and in some cases, groups of armed civilians defended their own neighborhoods from perceived threats by neighbors. These dynamics mirrored those observed in other ancient cities under siege, illustrating how extreme stress and scarcity can destabilize even long-standing urban communities. The cumulative effect of internal conflicts, scarcity, and fear left Jerusalem highly vulnerable. By the time Babylonian forces launched their final assault, organized defense was minimal. Residents were physically and psychologically exhausted, soldiers were demoralized, and social cohesion had all but collapsed. The Babylonians breached the walls with relatively little resistance, encountering scattered pockets of defenders rather than a coordinated defense. Once inside, Babylonian troops quickly secured control, ending the city's prolonged internal and external crisis. The fall of Jerusalem was followed by systematic actions designed to neutralize remaining resistance and secure Babylonian authority. Deportations removed political, military, and religious leaders, further dismantling potential opposition. Survivors were left to contend with the destruction of infrastructure, homes, and religious centers. The combination of internal conflict, famine, and the external military threat had ensured that Jerusalem's collapse was total and irreversible in its political form. The internal struggles during the siege, including street-level confrontations, factional clashes, and family disputes over survival, are essential for understanding the human dimension of Jerusalem's fall. The city's destruction was not only a result of Babylonian military superiority, but also of the social and psychological pressures that tore the population apart from within. Hunger, fear, and political division weakened the city's capacity to resist, illustrating the complex interplay between external assault and internal fragmentation during times of prolonged crisis. After the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the consequences for Judah and its people were immediate, severe, and long-lasting. The city lay in ruins, the temple destroyed, and the royal household deported to Babylon. The once thriving capital, which had been a center of political authority, religious activity, and cultural identity, was transformed into a place of silence, rubble, and despair. For those who remained in the land, daily life became an exercise in survival under foreign administration, while for those taken into exile, adaptation to Babylonian society marked the beginning of a profound transformation of Judean identity. The Babylonians, having accomplished their military objective, implemented administrative policies to stabilize the region. Rather than depopulating Judah entirely, Babylon allowed a segment of the population to remain, primarily consisting of the poor, laborers, and small-scale farmers. These residents were supervised by Babylonian-appointed officials, including the governor Gedaliah, until his assassination by Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, further destabilized the region. The remaining population faced economic hardship and social disarray, but continued to cultivate land and maintain a semblance of everyday life, albeit under strict oversight and constant awareness of Babylonian authority. Those deported to Babylon experienced a drastically different reality. Historical and archaeological evidence, particularly from the El Yahudu tablets, shows that Judeans were not imprisoned, but rather settled in communities integrated into the Babylonian economy. These settlements included agricultural estates, canals, and towns where Judeans could work, trade, and maintain family structures. Although politically powerless, they retained ethnic and cultural identity, observed dietary laws, and practiced their religion in adapted forms. Many Judeans adopted Babylonian techniques in farming, record-keeping, and commerce while preserving communal cohesion through language, rituals, and education. Religious life, profoundly disrupted by the destruction of the temple, shifted towards synagogue-like gatherings, study, and prayer. Sacrificial worship, central to Judean religion, was impossible, so the community relied increasingly on law, scripture, and ethical instruction as the means of maintaining identity. Prophets and teachers played a critical role, guiding communities, interpreting current events, and offering hope that survival and fidelity to tradition could preserve the essence of Judean society even in exile. This period laid the foundations for the codification of key texts, which later became central to the Hebrew Bible. In Babylon, exiled leaders like Jehoiakim, the former king, were given symbolic positions within the empire. Jehoiakim was provided with rations, housing, and a measure of status, reflecting Babylonian strategy of controlling former elites without completely marginalizing them. His presence in exile reinforced the notion of continuity of identity, offering a living connection to the fallen monarchy while demonstrating that political power had shifted decisively to Babylon. The survival of royal lineages in exile, even under limited authority, provided both a psychological anchor for the population and a mechanism for maintaining communal memory. While the Judean population adjusted to life in Babylon, the land of Judah itself became a sparsely populated province. The social fabric was strained by the aftermath of war, famine, and political dislocation. Small groups of survivors attempted to maintain agricultural production, but without centralized leadership and with frequent disruptions, productivity remained low. The assassination of Gedaliah highlighted the fragility of governance under Babylonian oversight, leading many to flee southward to Egypt. Those who stayed were left to contend with both internal disputes and the ongoing presence of foreign officials. The psychological impact of these events cannot be understated. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple represented not just a physical loss, but a rupture in cultural and religious continuity. Families and communities grappled with trauma, grief, and uncertainty. Famine, scarcity, and violence during the siege had left deep scars, and the exile compounded this sense of dislocation. Nevertheless, Judeans demonstrated resilience, creating social structures, preserving traditions, and developing new religious practices that would ensure the survival of their identity across generations. The period of exile also saw the emergence of a new vision of collective identity. Without a temple, monarchy, or central territory, Judeans came to understand their relationship with their history, laws, and traditions as defining elements of community. Rituals of prayer, dietary laws, and observance of sacred texts became central to cohesion. Scribes and teachers assumed an elevated role, tasked with recording history, interpreting sacred law, and transmitting knowledge. The destruction of Jerusalem thus paradoxically strengthened the emphasis on textual preservation and legal continuity, shaping a model of society that could survive outside the boundaries of a single city or political entity. Meanwhile, in the wider region, Babylonian policies evolved. Nebuchadnezzar's successors were less capable administrators, and internal instability weakened imperial control. These developments created opportunities for emerging powers, most notably the Persians under Cyrus II. In 539 BCE, Cyrus conquered Babylon without significant resistance, bringing a new imperial approach to the region. Unlike the Babylonians, who had enforced deportation and suppression, Cyrus pursued a policy of restoration. He allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands, rebuild temples, and re-establish religious centers, as documented in the Cyrus Cylinder and corroborated in later historical and biblical accounts. For the Judeans, Cyrus's policy opened the possibility of return, though the process was gradual. Some remained in Babylon, where they had established livelihoods and communities, while others took the opportunity to journey back to Judah. This return marked a pivotal moment in Judean history, initiating a period of reconstruction, both materially and spiritually. Jerusalem itself was slowly rebuilt, beginning with fortifications, houses, and public structures. The temple was eventually reconstructed, albeit on a smaller scale than the original. and religious practice resumed in a new form that emphasized law, communal observance, and covenantal fidelity rather than royal leadership. The post-exilic community operated under a new political paradigm. Judah was no longer an independent kingdom but a province within a larger imperial system. Local governance was conducted under Persian oversight, with appointed governors and religious leaders managing civic and spiritual affairs. The community adapted to these conditions, balancing obedience to imperial authority with maintenance of cultural and religious identity. The experience of exile had reinforced the centrality of law, scripture, and communal cohesion, ensuring that survival did not depend solely on political sovereignty. Social structures were also reshaped during this period. Returning populations had to integrate those who had remained in the land with those who had experienced life in Babylon. Differences in experience, wealth, and cultural exposure created tensions that required negotiation and adaptation. Religious leaders played a crucial role in mediating these tensions, guiding the community toward shared norms and reinforcing practices that would unify the population despite divergent experiences. Economically, Judah began a slow recovery. Agricultural production resumed, local markets were re-established, and trade networks were partially restored. However, the scale of the population was smaller, and the infrastructure had been damaged extensively. Rebuilding required cooperation, labor mobilization, and adaptation to a new political and economic reality under Persian rule. The community's resilience was evident in the gradual reconstruction of the temple and the reorganization of civic life, demonstrating the ability to restore continuity after decades of disruption. Culturally, the exile and subsequent return had a profound impact on Judean identity. The collective memory of destruction, deportation, and survival became central to narratives of history, law, and religion. Texts written or edited during exile emphasized themes of covenant, fidelity, justice, and divine providence. These texts reinforced communal values and provided guidance for living under foreign rule while maintaining distinct identity. The exile, while traumatic, thus produced a stronger emphasis on tradition, education, and law as central pillars of society. The destruction of Jerusalem and the exile experience also influenced Judean attitudes toward leadership and power. The failure of monarchy to protect the city and the destruction caused by military conquest led to a reevaluation of reliance on kingship. Leadership became more decentralized, with religious and community figures assuming greater responsibility. This shift laid the groundwork for future governance structures that emphasize law, ritual, and communal decision-making over centralized political authority. The consequences of exile extended beyond immediate survival. They shaped the ethical, spiritual, and cultural frameworks of the community. The experience of displacement, loss, and eventual return highlighted the importance of adaptability, communal cohesion, and cultural memory. These lessons became integral to Judean identity, informing social norms, religious practice, and historical consciousness for generations. The trauma of the siege, the devastation of the city, and the challenges of exile were transformed into a narrative of resilience, teaching the community how to endure, preserve identity, and rebuild in the face of overwhelming adversity. By the time the Persian period solidified, Judah had evolved into a society capable of maintaining identity without reliance on monarchy or temple centrality alone. Religious, cultural, and legal structures enabled continuity across generations. Stories of Jerusalem's fall, the exile, and the return were passed down orally and in writing, ensuring that the memory of these events remained central to communal life. The collective experience of suffering and survival became a defining element of Judean history, shaping perceptions of God, law, and society. The fall of Jerusalem and the subsequent exile under Babylonian rule thus stand as pivotal moments in ancient history, illustrating both the destructive capacity of imperial conquest and the resilience of human communities in preserving identity and tradition. These events influenced political structures, religious practices, and social organization in ways that extended far beyond the immediate generation, demonstrating the lasting impact of historical trauma on cultural and spiritual development. In conclusion, the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of its people, and the eventual return under Persian authorization represent a narrative of devastation, adaptation, and renewal. The city's fall highlighted vulnerabilities to external military power, internal political division, and social strain, while the exile demonstrated the capacity for cultural preservation and identity formation under displacement. The return under Cyrus facilitated the reconstruction of society, law, and religious life, setting the stage for a resilient Judean community capable of enduring through centuries of political uncertainty. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel Squint Lab for more historical explorations, documentaries, and in-depth narratives that bring the past to life.